So we've looked at humans as animals, looking at the altricial precocial spectrum, and we've looked at the landmark figures of Piaget and Vygotsky. And one theme that's coming out is something that arises in many, many contexts. It's the old question of nature versus nurture. Here we're dealing with competing claims from the domains of biology and of culture. And sometimes that's helpful, but we need to be very, very careful here because our explanations can often oversimplify. If we look at the achievements of an animal, we frequently say that's instinct. Instinct is a very problematic word. It's a way of suggesting that animals manage something spectacular, but without human intelligence. So there's a bit of human chauvinism every time we use the word instinct. Same thing goes for hardwired. If we say that a behavior is hardwired or built in, we're dealing with a mechanistic notion of the body there, which is a little unrealistic. On the other hand, we sometimes look at someone who's born gifted and we say, oh man, you've got talent. You're a born runner. You're a born pianist. Now, of course, nobody's born playing the piano, but some people take to playing the piano far more easily than others. So our notion of talent lies in here. If you say, I just wasn't born with the talent, you're relying on this slightly uneasy distinction between biology or nature and experience in a given context or culture. Such questions are really important because when someone does something bad, supposing Christopher Robin kills his grandmother with an axe, we have to look at that and we have to say, is that because Christopher Robin was born bad? Or should we blame the parents? Should we blame the environment that turned him bad? And this discussion happens again and again and again as we try to apportion responsibility. In the case of law, we choose an arbitrary cutoff point and we say, okay, before this date, usually 18 or 16, you're a minor and therefore not entirely responsible for your actions. And we're going to blame society and parents and everything like this. But after a certain date, a magical date, you're fully responsible for your actions and you can't get away with blaming your environment. That's clearly a useful way of dealing with things in law, but it doesn't reflect reality. It's not the case that you wake up on your 18th birthday and now suddenly you're competent and responsible, whereas the previous evening you were helpless and irresponsible. When we oversimplify here, nature is often portrayed as the inevitable, the determined, and culture is entirely free and symbolic. Now, science comes in many varieties. We've got social sciences, biological sciences, all kinds of sciences. They're plural, and they don't add up to a single story. So we need to be quite careful when we simplify things. And because you're going to encounter the nature-nurture notion, the idea that explanations should be on one side or another side of a kind of a strict divide, we need to look at that a little bit. There are two fancy words we use here which are very important. You today have a particular form and you have specific capacities. Some of those we can trace back in the development of your body from birth. This is called ontogenesis. And you can see from the diagram here, in the course of ontogenesis, your body changes form quite a bit. And we often say that what goes on in ontogenesis is in some sense personal. But that's not the only route by which you got here. Phylogenesis is the much longer process of evolutionary history, starting with the most primitive forms of life, which gave rise to, among other things, your parents, which gave rise to you. Those entire suite of processes also shaped you. They ended up giving you a particular number of fingers and thumbs. It's unclear quite how much we should attribute to processes of phylogenesis and how much we should attribute to processes of ontogenesis. We meet this uncertainty again and again. The empiricist John Locke described the newborn infant as a blank slate. For him, biology was finished and culture could now come in. In the theory of universal grammar, Noam Chomsky is asserting that biology has done most of the work of the linguist and culture is just going to supply a couple of little bits. All such claims are always contested. You're going to go out and do things today, and what you do is going to depend on your personal history or ontogeny and its influences. And it's also going to depend entirely on your phylogeny, and partitioning those influences is pretty much a fool's game. You don't partition into hardwired abilities and the mere accretions of culture. You don't split that way, and nor does anybody else. But we tend to think dichotomously, as if there were explanations of the complexity of the human that were purely biological or purely in the social sciences, for example. And this kind of thinking has given rise to great curiosity we have about such things as twins. Now, twins are born in almost identical circumstances. Twins, of course, come in different varieties. There are identical twins who share a common gene pool, and there are fraternal twins who don't, who come from two separate eggs and have two different sets of genes. So those interested in sorting out the diverse contributions of biology and culture have long looked to twin studies to help try to separate out, to do this act of separation. And such studies, they were in vogue in the 1980s, I suppose you could say. Twin studies have been done before the 1980s, and twin studies still go on today. But around the 1980s, you had a view of genetics, which has changed in the meantime. In the 1980s, roughly, genes were seen as the biological specification of the form of the grown-up body. We don't see genes that way anymore. Genes are very important, but they're mixed up in so many other processes that in genetics too, we have stopped trying to separate nature from nurture in this way. The psychologist Vaughan Bell put this quite well in 2009 when he said, simple nature versus nurture is a bit of a lie. Music isn't melody versus rhythm. Wine isn't grapes versus alcohol. And we are not environment versus genes. We are their sum, their product, and their expression. Puts it very nicely. They dance together and we are their performance, but neither is an adversary. The art of understanding this elegant ballet is complex and arcane. But you might never realize this from reading the quoted results primarily of genetic studies, because the extent to which a trait is heritable, that is accounted for genetics, is usually expressed as a single percentage. And that number hides all this complexity. You see, genes don't have intrinsic meaning. They mean nothing without an organism in an environment. So there's no rational sense in which we can cleanly separate biology from culture or nature from nurture. There are reasons to put on our biological goggles. There are reasons to put on our cultural goggles. There are reasons not to overcomplicate everything. But we need to be cautious in being overly simplistic in such terms. And I think that's a very important lesson that we can learn from studies of human learning and development.